Election integrity, let's jump on that because this is your baby. I believe this is the beginning of our discussion today that's going to get you going. So could you talk a little bit about election integrity, the 2010, what kind of results we had? Now you and I disagree a little bit. I'm a firm believer that there's always going to be indiscretions at some point, but you mentioned before we started there's a checks and balances process too. So could you talk about a little bit about integrity of the 2010 elections and what you discovered, what Minnesota majority discovered?
Sure. Well, if you don't mind, I want to take it back a little bit.
That's fine.
To the 2008 election.
Go ahead.
This is when we first noticed that there was a problem with our election system. It was actually before the 2008 election. We were using the statewide voter registration voter history file, which is publicly available to anybody that wants it.
And what is this again?
This is a list of every registered voter in the state and their voter history. So it tells you.
That's public information?
It absolutely is.
So every time I go vote, it's public information and people can find out when I voted?
They'll know that you voted.
Not what I voted, but
not who you vote for. That's always anonymous.
Okay.
But, the fact that you voted, your address, and if you provide it, your telephone number is in that file.
Okay.
And that's why we were using it. We were doing survey calls on issues that Minnesota majority was going to consider championing for that legislative session.
Okay.
And we wanted, we're called Minnesota majority because we champion majority issues.
Okay.
When the majority of people in the state say, this is what we want, that's what we go after.
Okay.
Like voter ID is one of those things, 80% majority. And as we were going through the list, we were finding a lot of strange anomalies in the file. There were duplicate voter registrations in there. There were people that our survey volunteers would call and they were told, well, I'm sorry, that person passed away. They're dead. But they're still on the voter rolls. And that's not supposed to happen. And
now, who's responsible for the integrity of this list?
Well, the Secretary of State ultimately, but also some responsibility lies with the county auditors, all 87 of them. Right. We discovered there were people in there that they were answering to our volunteers, well, I don't vote because I'm not a citizen. Well, you're registered to vote. So with all of these problems that we were finding in the list, it kind of raised our eyebrows and we took note of them.
And you weren't looking for this?
We stumbled into it entirely by accident. We just said, there's some problems here.
And this is in 2008 in the primary?
Well, it was during the summer of 2008 when we first started making these observations.
Okay.
And after we were done with that research project we were doing, we decided to compile all of our findings and look a little deeper into the problems. So we ran a national change of address match on the voter registration rolls and discovered that there were thousands of addresses that the United States Postal Service said were invalid, that they don't exist.
Now, these are all that somebody had applied for voter registration. As presumably, the card was sent out by the state, and that card went back to the county and all these other processes you mentioned supposedly have happened, but apparently they didn't happen?
There were some failures. There were definitely some failures in the system, like duplicate voter registrations, for example, is not supposed to happen. The Secretary of State is required to remove duplicates. Now, that might happen if you move and you do an election day registration at your new precinct. Well, your old voter registration stays on the rolls for that election cycle, and then your new one gets added to it. So now you've got two listings, two different voter registrations for the same person. When that happens, they're supposed to delete the old one and merge them together, but they were failing to do that. When they fail, that leaves your line unsigned blank at your old polling place. So if somebody knows you've just moved, they could walk in, because we don't require identification in this state, and say, I'm Tim Oots, and then they'll say, sign right here.
Because that's what happens. I walk in, they say your name, and I say, and they look down at this and flip it around, and I sign it.
Yeah, so we were concerned about this. We brought all of our findings to the attention of the Secretary of State in October of 2008, just requesting him, look into this. There's a major election coming up, and we want to make sure this is cleaned up before the election. And instead of answering our concerns and investigating it, he pulled together a press conference and brought in some of his favorite county auditors and election managers and just gave assurances. Minnesota has the best election system in the country. We do all of these verification checks. There's nothing to see here. Everything's fine.
But you had found several thousand issues.
Well, we didn't have full confidence in his answer, so after the election we started doing some more research.
This is after November?
After the November 2008 election. During the contentious Franken-Coleman recount that was going on, we started digging into the records. Now, unfortunately, even though they're supposed to have all the records done by law within 6 weeks after an election, as far as voter histories and voter registrations being entered into the statewide system, it took them 6 months to get the work done.
Okay,
So-
I got a quick question for you. Who has authority over the Secretary of State to tell the Secretary of State, you're not allowed to have 6 months, you got 6 weeks? Who enforces the law that, is that a court?
The
Is that-
courts.
but nobody brings it to the courts aren't going to address it.
That's right.
So who would bring it to the courts? Or can the governor walk down the hallway to the Secretary of State's office and say, hey, get busy?
Well, he could, but it would be an informal request sort of thing. You can't really order the Secretary of State. He's an elected official, so he's kind of independent in that respect, except there's court supervision. In fact, we're in a couple of legal battles with the Secretary
So
of
right
State
now, there's no checks and balances in this process that are effective. If I'm not doing my job, somebody ought to be over my shoulder telling me to do my job.
Yes, and we're trying to hold our election officials accountable. That's why we have brought some lawsuits revolving around these timeliness issues of record updates. So,
Because if it takes 6 months, you're running into a whole bunch of other
well, there was a
issues.
problem. See, we also discovered in 2008 that over 2,000 ineligible felon voters participated in the election.
And how did they say I'm a felon on their application? Or I mean,
Nope, but we did a data practices request, which is like a Freedom of Information Act request here in Minnesota for Bureau of Criminal Apprehension data.
Okay.
And they provided us a list of everyone that had been convicted of a felony over the last 10 years.
Okay.
So we were able to boil that list down to only people that would still be under sentence, generally still on probation, on Election Day 2008.
Okay.
And then we compared that list to the voter registration.
you were busy back in 2008, weren't you?
We're still doing this research. We're doing it for 2010 right now. We found another 1,000 suspected felon voters.
So when
in
you did your
2010.
research in 2008 after the election, how many? 100 people were, there's a discrepancy, 100 people, 10,000? What were we looking at for discrepancy when you
Well,
did your
by
research?
discrepancy, you mean like how many more ballots there were than voters
Right,
that were accounted
right.
for? Following the 2008 election, we initially found that there were 40,000 more ballots certified than voter histories in the voter registration system. We complained about that. We said, where's the rest of this data? You're missing 40,000 voters. And they went into a panic at that point. I heard from their legal counsel at the Secretary of State's office that it appears we have a widespread problem, they told us. So we sued. We took it to the Supreme Court, straight to the Supreme Court under the errors and omissions statute in Minnesota.
You avoided all the lower court issues.
Well, under the statute, if there's an error or omission in an election, it goes straight to the Supreme Court. That's
Okay.
where it goes. The Supreme Court disagreed. They felt they didn't have jurisdiction and said if we want to pursue that, we have to go to a lower court. So they dismissed without prejudice, leaving us the option to take it to a lower court, which eventually we did. We took it to the Office of Administrative Hearings, and we're in an appeals process with that right now.
and we're
over
talking
this
from
issue.
2008, you're still in this.
2008 and 2010, the same problem persists. They're not updating the records on time, and when they do get them done, they're incomplete. Or there's some other explanation, like someone stuffing ballot boxes because we've got more ballots than accounted for voters.
Okay, as a layman, somebody who goes in on November 2nd and just votes, how do you stuff a ballot? I mean, and who's overseeing the ballot process? So just,
Well, if you were
if that's what
handed
you-
by mistake, for example, two ballots, sometimes they stick together a little bit. You know, the election judge gives you, thinking they're just giving you one, maybe there's two.
Okay.
And you go back to the booth and you fill them both in and slip them both into the machine. That's one way. But in order to do massive ballot box stuffing, you would probably have to be an election worker. You'd have to be an election judge. And there's a process in place to prevent that sort of fraud from having too big of an impact, especially on statewide races.
Well, we're talking 40,000, a discrepancy of 40,000. That's not just an accidental two ballots here or there. That's a.
Well, it could be as, 10 per precinct with over 4,000 precincts in the state.
Well, that gives you 40,000. So could it be an indeliberate, or you're?
Some of it could be mistakes, sure. Some of it could be fraud. We don't really know for sure what the reason is, but we know that this problem exists. We know we've got more
and is
ballots.
the Secretary of State cooperating with Minnesota Majority and trying to resolve these issues?
No. No, he's been rather defiant in this aspect. We've asked him.
What's the purpose of being defiant and keeping integrity in the election process?
Well,
He's an
you'd
elected
have-
official responsible for the integrity of the voting ballot to the state citizens of the state.
You'd have to ask the Secretary of State that. I don't know what his reasoning is. We've tried to pursue resolution to this in a cooperative fashion with the Secretary of State, but he's stonewalled us and tried to thwart our research. at every turn. So we've had to turn to the final solution of going to court. And we've actually got 2 lawsuits pending right now with the Secretary of State.
And the Secretary of State is Mark Ritchie, correct? So just want so people know that who the Secretary of State is, because a lot of people don't even know who a lot of people are. We're ignorant. And so it's Mark Ritchie that you, and specifically Mark Ritchie because he is the Secretary of State. He's responsible for that whole department within the Secretary of State's office.
Yes, he is.